Here in the outskirts of the Belgian town of Ypres lies a section of the British trench line, the front line. This is a reconstruction that gives you an idea of what it would have been like here in the trenches in Belgium. From here in July 1915, British troops came out of the trenches and attacked towards the German lines just a few hundred yards opposite. 600 British soldiers were killed in the fighting that followed. For 3.5 years, this was the front line in which hundreds of thousands of soldiers served. Trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. The advantage was always on for the defender, in fixed positions, with machine guns, behind barbed wire, in trenches. They could shelter in dugouts from a bombardment and come out and face the attack. Again and again for 3.5 years, the British, French and Allied forces attacked for huge, huge cost of life. The area around Ypres was a killing field. And the question has to be asked, was the war worth it? And was it prosecuted in the right way? For that, we're going to ask two experts. Nigel James, who's written a book about Britain in 1914 and has walked the Western Front and published War Walk, detailing his experiences of walking the trench line. And Neil Faulkner, an archaeologist who's editor of Military History Monthly and is one of the organisers of the No Glory campaign, which seeks to ensure that in this centenary year of the First World War, we don't glorify war.
In that summer in early autumn of 1914, the Germans came very close to victory, didn't they?
They did indeed. It almost was a rerun of what they did in 1870 in France, and indeed what they would do 20 years later, a war won in 6 weeks. That was the German plan, and then that they wanted to turn against their main strength against Russia. It nearly worked, but in what looked very good as a blueprint war plan didn't actually work out on the ground. The Germans marched too far, too fast. They outstripped their supplies. They got hot and exhausted in the heat of high summer. And another factor was the arrival of the British on their flanks far earlier than the Germans anticipated. They knew they risked going to war with Britain. They didn't think that Britain's little professional army would get to France in time to stop them. And although the Britons didn't stop them, they in fact held them up in 2 battles and disrupted the smooth unrolling of the Schlieffen Plan timetable. So there was then a counterattack on the River Marne. The Germans retreated or withdrew, and the lines solidified into the trench lines, which stayed the same for the next 4 years.
This, of course, was the German nightmare. They were now faced with a war on 2 fronts, which is something from going back to the days of Bismarck, half a century before. They tried to avoid a war with Britain and France in the west and with Russia in the east.
Yes, no, that's right. I'm sure this is where Nigel and I are going to be in more or less complete agreement on the details of the military history. And I don't think anybody really, on any side, had any clear conception about what it was going to be like. I think nobody'd come to terms with the ability of modern industrial economies to equip and arm very large numbers of men with state-of-the-art firepower, put them into the line and create such a defensive concentration of men and firepower that the fronts go into lockdown and you get trench war attrition, and that, it seems, my feeling about it is that once Germany is locked into that, they're losing the war. Yeah. They've started to lose the war because they are outgunned.
But that's strange, though, because there had been examples. The American Civil War was much earlier, but it already been seen new technology used. The Balkans Wars, the Russian-Japanese War in 1905. So they seem to have been ignoring the evidence that was there, that this is what could happen.
Yes. There were some people who knew it was going to be a long war. I mean, the famous Lord Kitchener, he of the famous recruiting post of the finger and the moustache, he said almost alone, this is going to be a long war. We're going to need hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men, not just our small professional army. But Neil is right that once Germany got hunkered down in their trench lines, they were essentially on defensive. They didn't plan again to break out of that. Once or twice they took the offensive, for example at Verdun in 1916, but that wasn't to take Paris or anything like that. That was to bleed France white and get France to sue for peace. Essentially it was defensive. And what causes, I think, a lot of the feelings of revulsion that we feel now about British losses in the war, British and Commonwealth or Empire losses as it was then, is the fact that it was the Allies who were constantly taking the offensive, and defensive technology was so strong with barbed wire and deep entrenchments that the offensive troops were bound to suffer huge
that does bring me to the
casualties.
question, the famous phrase, I think coined by the historian and politician Alan Clark, lions led by donkeys, to describe the British Army. I mean, is there any truth in that argument, that these were lions led by donkeys?
My feeling about that argument, I've got a sort of double-edged response to that, because it comes up every time one discusses the First World War. On the one hand, I think it's a caricature. In that, what Nigel has said is absolutely right. The basic problem was the technology. The basic problem was that you had a heavily defensive military technology, and you didn't yet have the mechanisms for breaking through those trench lines. That comes, of course, subsequently. So in a way, the generals are trapped by the circumstances. On the other, what I would say is this. I think a class-based army, which is what the British Army and all of the other armies were, where you select your officers from a relatively small pool, a relatively small social group, does tend to mean that you get a concentration of stupidity, and you don't create the possibility for talent to rise and experience of what is actually happening on the ground to then be reflected into recruitment into your officer corps. And you have a low level of motivation, I think, at the base. The most effective armies in history have invariably been armies of free men and women. The classic example in British history, of course, is Cromwell's army. An army of self-motivated men, and nowadays sometimes women as well, who are in control of what is going on, who very often are electing their officers and debating strategy and tactics, and who are therefore very, very highly motivated. Had we had more of that in the First World War, I don't think we'd have had the madness of some of the things that happened, for example, on the first day of the Somme.
I do agree, and it's interesting that two of the more imaginative generals, we're not talking a great high bar of standard here, but two of the more imaginative generals on the Allied side, Currie of Canada and Monash of Australia, were outside the rigid class system that Neil has been talking about. That's interesting.
But it's also interesting, I mean, there were, Neil's alluded to it, but new tactics were evolved. I mean, actually by a Russian general, Brusilov, in the first instance, and then the Germans took it up well, of new tactics which could break that trench logjam in the trench war. Would you like to explain?
Yeah, well, of course, when people talk about breaking the trench lines, one of the major things they're talking about is the arrival of the tank, a weapon developed in secret actually by the Admiralty under Winston Churchill, who was always fond of new gadgetry and was always looking for a new way round, as he was in the Second World War, a way round the Western Front and breaking in the back door, the soft underbelly, as he called it. And his department, the Admiralty, developed the tank as a land ship, even had a naval nomenclatura, or the tank, which was the code word for it. And this was a genuine breakthrough in the war. It was a bit thrown away because they needed it on the Somme. They weren't ready for it, and only a few came on and half of them broke down. But when they were used en masse and properly, there was an initial breakthrough. So the tank was an important weapon of war. The aeroplane, of course, which at the beginning of the war only thought of as at best an observation instrument, was used increasingly for fighter purposes and then again for bombers. We had the first raid on London. The Gotha bombers came over and surprised everyone. So if you like, the bomber plane was the German equivalent of the tank. Or submarine warfare, a hugely important development. First of all, it came near to starving Britain out in 1917. And in my opinion, one of the reasons behind the revolution that Neil was talking about in Germany was the blockade caused by the fact that the German surface fleet had been bottled up in port, and the Allies were able to blockade and stop it food imports.
I'll come back to that, the economic war, but return. I mean, the Germans in particular did develop these new tactics for breaking through in terms of trench warfare.
Yes, and I'm in full agreement with everything that Nigel has said, and I would just add this, that what is also happening is that as the new technology is becoming capable of supporting what's happening on the ground and breaking through the trench lines, what you've also got, I think, is a revolution in infantry tactics. tactics, where instead of having lines of riflemen moving across the battlefield, what you've got is what is sometimes called a kind of blob tactics, where you have little groups of men. Very often it will be a light machine gun, some riflemen, some bombers. They may have a light mortar as well, but it's a group of weapons specialists, if you like, who are working together, and they move across the battlefield, adapting to it, using cover, trying to infiltrate around strong points and take strong points from the rear, and so on. Now that's a new kind of infantry tactics, which of course becomes the standard way in which infantry fight in the Second World War, but that is definitely being pioneered by the Germans in 1917, and then increasingly copied by the other powers.
Now, before we come back to the course of the war, both sides extended the war. Both sides took on allies. The Germans already had the Austro-Hungarians, the British and French already had the Russians, soon the Ottomans, and into the Balkans. These were unreliable allies, if not liabilities, were they not?
Well, I think both sides had unreliable allies. Of course, the most unreliable ally on the Allied side, the most important one in the end, proved to be Russia, which was knocked out of the war halfway through with the Russian Revolution. Fortunately for the Allies, they were able to compensate with that by bringing in the other superpower of the late 20th century, America, who joined the war almost exactly at the same time as Russia left it. So that was possible. Romania and Italy were unreliable allies of the Allies, but then again, at the end of the war, Austria and Bulgaria proved very unreliable allies of the Germans. So both the major powers had unreliable allies.
And that would lead to revolution, not just in Russia.
Yes, I mean, I think what happens in that period, really, it's ramping up in 1917, and then it explodes across the whole of Europe in 1918, is that you're seeing the breaks come where the state is particularly weak, where the industrial base is weak. That's where it's happening initially. So Russia is a weak link, and so the Russian Revolution breaks out first. But there are similar things happening elsewhere. Italy, for example, which is barely an industrial power by this period, and yet is fighting an industrialized war, has this complete breaking of the Italian line in October, November 1917, and hundreds of thousands at Caporetto, hundreds of thousands of Italian troops streaming out of the line, saying that they're going home and that, you know, we're up with Russia. They're chanting as they go past the Commander-in-Chief's staff car. But then, of course, that revolutionary movement gets to the very heart of Europe, and the most powerful state, the most powerful industrial economy, Germany itself, then falls to revolution. Now, Nigel's right, of course. It is the pressure of the blockade. It is the attrition on the Western Front. It is the impact of the war. But it's also the case that it's a resurgence of that underlying resistance to the ruling elite and the ruling order that was suppressed in 1914.
But sure, it wasn't just that. It was also the question of nationalism. For instance, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was to break up along national lines. It wasn't just a question of class.
Absolutely. The fault lines of the Austro-Hungarian Empire were already there long before the war, and the war just merely exposed them and broke them apart. In fact, I've just been reading a study called A Mad Catastrophe, which argues that the Austro-Hungarian Empire lost the whole war in the first few weeks of the war. It failed to even beat little Serbia, the original country which it had attacked at the very start of the war. And Germany, of course, was forced to wade in and support its weak sister ally. Neil didn't mention another result of the Russian Revolution was a wholesale mutiny in the French army. Starting as a protest against military ineptitude, they were ordered into an offensive which got nowhere, which cost thousands and thousands of lives, sparked a mutiny of almost 2/3 of the whole French army. But it quickly took on a political character. However, I think he underestimates the forces of nationalism and patriotism, and the fact remains that the vast majority of soldiers did remain loyal to their antiquated command structures, their officers and their generals. I think this was probably more it became more peer pressure. They didn't want to let down their comrades who were fighting alongside them than hatred for the enemy. I think that kicked in.
And the British Army didn't see any of this, did it? I mean, the British Army was solid to the core.
I'm afraid it wasn't. You know, this is hidden history. I mean, the British establishment has always been very, very good at hiding mutinies and strikes and resistance and so on, and keeping them below the radar. But the reality is that there were serious mutinies inside the British Army, and of course after the war, large numbers of demobilised soldiers become part of a wave of radicalisation in Britain and a wave of strikes and so on. In 1919, Britain, I think, is probably quite close to revolution. But it's worth mentioning.
Revolution in Britain?
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. I mean, I think in 1919 in particular. But I think it's also worth mentioning, Chris, that Harry Patch, who is lauded as the last fighting Tommy, who died in 2009. If you read Harry Patch's memoir, he describes a mutiny in which he participated. I mean, he describes a mutiny, you know, a confrontation between a bullying officer and a group of him and his mates who basically level loaded rifles at the bullying officer.
I mean, Nigel, the British Empire faced a challenge by class forces. Surely the biggest challenge was nationalism again.
I mean, Neil is taking a microscope to big this one up, but in actual fact, I don't think that Britain was seriously menaced by the threat of revolution, at least not in 1919. If we're talking the general strike 10 years later, 8 years later, maybe. But these mutinies were mainly about bread and butter issues like slowness of demobilisation. They weren't really about let's establish a Soviet Britain.
Britain was facing a challenge elsewhere in its empire. I mean, very near at home in Dublin in 1916, wasn't it?
Certainly. We haven't even talked about Britain and Ireland, but essentially what happened in the First World War in Ireland was large numbers of Irishmen joined the British Army, went off to fight. A small number of revolutionary Republicans stayed behind and fomented an insurrection which took over the centre of Dublin for about a week. Bloody fighting. They did not have the sympathy of the vast majority of Irish, but the way the British put down that insurrection, and especially the way they shot 14 of its leaders, completely turned Irish sympathies around and led almost directly to independent Ireland, to the struggle for independent Ireland.
I want to talk about something you talked about, was that one of the key tactics of the British in particular was to apply this economic blockade against Germany, which meant that by the 1917, 1918, hunger was a reality, not for the combatants, but for the civilian population of Germany.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Germany lost, I think, about 2.5 million altogether in the First World War, but 1/3 of those were basically civilians who had starved to death, died of malnutrition. So this, it seems to me, is a very clear example of just how brutal modern industrialised warfare is. And this is a crucial argument for me, you see, because I look at the system and I see these competing ruling classes, these competing nation states representing powerful industrial interests and financial interests, and I see the consequences of these forces creating very, very powerful armies and plunging the world into a 4-year war. I see the consequences for ordinary people. And it doesn't matter what side of the divide they're on, it doesn't matter whether they're German or British or whoever. The fact is that very large numbers of young men are having their lives destroyed at the front, and very large numbers of people, and in fact, as the 20th century has gone on, increasing numbers of people behind the front line are having their lives destroyed. And you can see that today, of course, in Syria. The effect of modern industrialised warfare in Syria is the displacement of almost half the population now. That's the sort of thing that happens.
And Nigel, do you see the economic blockade as crucial to the outcome of the war?
Very much so. The last winter of the war was known as the Hunger Winter. People were living on turnips if they were living at all. Coffee was totally unobtainable. Shoe leather was unobtainable. Children were going barefoot through the winter. Yes, I would agree that that was the primary reason, that and the seemingly unending nature of the war behind the revolution and mutinies which swept Germany in 1918. I go along with Neil on that, certainly. I do think he underestimates the feelings of, if you like, the average Joe. Not all men who volunteered for the war, or even those who were conscripted, had revolutionary intentions in mind. The vast majority of them were not. They were prepared to fight. They were prepared to fight for their country. They were possessed of feelings of patriotism, however misplaced Neil might feel that. I mean, a Marxist would call that false consciousness, but the consciousness was definitely there. And I think the fact that revolution did not engulf Western Europe, either in 1918 or indeed in 1945, is a testimony to the fact that most people were not revolutionaries.
It's a good point, because in 1914 we had the whole European socialist movement, which represented millions of workers across Europe, lined up against the war, and suddenly the working classes of all the countries were rushing to enlist and celebrating to enlist. So that indicates that class consciousness was not that important in the situation.
No, I mean, this is an absolutely critical argument, because this goes back to there being two, the idea of there being two Europes. There's a Europe of the rulers and the people they represent, and there's the Europe of ordinary people. The war was not in the interest of ordinary people. It was not in the interest of a German miner to be put in a trench to shoot at a Welsh miner, for example. I mean, that's clearly insane for that to be happening. What then happens, of course, is that there is a collapse of the international socialist movement's leadership, and a complete failure by that leadership, in my view, to act on all of the promises that they had made and all the resolutions that they had passed, that they would internationally take action in the form of demonstrations and strikes and mutinies and so on to stop the war happening. That wave of resistance to war that might have ended the war before it had even got off the ground in 1914 didn't actually end it until 1917, 1918, because of the collapse, I think, of the leadership of the Second International, as it was called, which was the European Socialist Movement.
It wasn't socialism that ended the war, let's face it. It was military defeat and economic collapse that ended the war.
But was Germany militarily defeated in 1918? It came very close to winning once more in 1918.
Yes, in the spring of 1918, but by the autumn, its armies were on the run. It was in total collapse, and it sent a delegation across the lines to say, look guys, not only have our armies been defeated, but we're menaced by Bolshevik revolution. We've got to end the war. In my opinion, the Allies are always castigated for being too harsh at the end of the war. I think we should have done what we did in 1945, gone on and occupied Germany, and it's highly likely, in my view, that there would have been no Nazi movement had we done that.
That's a big jump in history. I want to come back to it. Was Germany militarily defeated, or was it defeated because of economic and political reasons?
No, I think it's both. I mean, you see, the door can be rotten, but somebody's got to kick it in. There's no question at all that there is absolutely massive pressure on German society because of the experience of 4 years of modern industrialised warfare. No question about that at all. It's also true that there was massive pressure on France and on Britain, and indeed all of those European societies. The fact that Germany went first was probably quite a close-run thing in reality, but what meant that Germany went first was the upsurge of revolution inside Germany. I mean, you've already said, Nigel, that there were French army mutinies in 1917. I've said that Britain was on the brink of revolution by 1919. Italy collapsed at the end of the Italian army on the Isonzo fronts collapsed at the end of 1917. So who's actually going to go first is a very close-run thing in my view.
Neil is ignoring the fact all these mutinies were put down, and the Allied armies in the latter half of 1918 were victorious, were winning, and the mutiny in France was succeeded by a very hardline nationalist premier, Georges Clemenceau, who acted more or less as a dictator and forced the war through to a victorious conclusion. And we're also ignoring the fact that America had joined the war on the Allied side.
There was one mutiny which was of decisive importance, though, was it not, when the German High Seas Fleet was ordered to set sail?
Absolutely. And that was, in my opinion, caused by factors that the High Seas Fleet had been rotting in port ever since since Jutland, and the sailors had basically got time to be radicalised. They'd been just breaking barnacles off the bottom of their ships. They were definitely radicalised and were the spearhead of the German Revolution. But more to the point was that the soldiers knew that their wives and children back home were starving. What the hell was that going to do for morale?
I want to talk we talked about America. We've already come on to how we're going to commemorate the war. The United States was hardly neutral prior to its entry into the war in June 1970, was it? Why did the United States in the end join the war, and what was its interests?
Well, I think we're at the beginning of the, what has been called the American century. I mean, the American economy by the time of the First World War was twice the size of the British economy, which had led the Industrial Revolution. So this was a fast expanding industrial, about to become superpower. And I think increasingly American capitalism is having to look beyond its own borders. Increasingly trade matters, investment opportunities abroad matter. The continuing development of American capitalism increasingly depends upon a projection of power beyond the North American continent. And I think what the American elite can see is the opportunity for America to advance its interests globally by intervening in the First World War, which is quite clearly going to lead to a new carve-up of the world. And I think what the Americans are hoping to do is to intervene in that process and influence that process and shape it in such a way as to create a world which is safe for the development of American capitalism.
In future episodes of The Great War, A War to End Wars, we will look at the consequences of the war for the Middle East, the role of Muslim troops fighting for the British Empire, ask how the war should be remembered, and what followed peace in November 1918.